Okay, it is 12 o'clock. I want to make sure that we have time. I'm very certain this is going to be a highly attended grand rounds. So we want to give time for people to join, but I want to make sure that you all have the appropriate time. So thank you, everybody, and welcome to the Department of Psychiatry's 30th Annual Gundry Lecture Series. This lecture series is funded by the Gundry family in honor of Rachel K. Gundry. Dr. Gundry comes from a long lineage of psychiatrists, including her grandfather, father, and two uncles, all of whom were graduates of the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She herself was a very strong advocate for women in medicine and was the first woman to do an internship at the Baltimore City Hospital, now known as Johns Hopkins Bayview Hospital. The Department of Psychiatry has dedicated this lectureship to mental health issues in the underserved and has taken the opportunity to invite leading women in the field to come and talk with us. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our lead speaker, Dr. Sheree Wilson. Dr. Wilson joined the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis in 2018 as the inaugural Associate Vice Chancellor and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, where she established the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Dr. Wilson is charged with leading, developing, and implementing innovative and comprehensive plans to foster a climate that is welcoming and inclusive for all who learn, teach, conduct research, and visit the medical campus. Under her tenure, a strategic plan for DEI has been created, a programming and professional development unit established, and a 26-member DEI liaison group has been formed. A diversity advisor toolkit developed, a school-wide understanding systemic racism curriculum implemented, and an inclusive excellence speaker series has been launched. Prior to joining Washington University, Dr. Wilson was an Associate Dean for Cultural Affairs and Diversity Initiative at the University of Iowa's Carver College of Medicine. Dr. Wilson earned her bachelor's degree from Ball State University and a master's and PhD from Indiana University. She completed a 9-month healthcare executive diversity and inclusion certificate program through the AAMC and Georgetown University. She also earned a certificate in emotionally intelligent leadership through Case Western Reserve University, Weatherhead School of Management. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Wilson, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Forrester. Thank you for the invitation. And I know I speak for my colleagues that we feel very honored to be a part of the Gundry Lecture Series. So again, very excited to be here. Like you said, maybe we're not more excited than you, but there was a lot of excitement here in St. Louis about today's session. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. So, going and okay, hopefully you're seeing my first slide. Yes, okay, I see Erin shaking yes. Okay, great, thank you. You see the names of my amazing co-presenters on the slide. I'll talk a little bit about each of them in just a second, and then they will also give you more extensive information about who they are. You can see the title of our session today is Confronting and Addressing Racism in Academic Medicine, a Comprehensive Strategy. So before we jump in, we always begin with our land acknowledgement, and we begin by acknowledging that Washington University in St. Louis is located on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, Illinois Confederacy, and many other tribes who were removed unjustly, and that we are the beneficiaries of that removal. We honor them as we live, work, and study at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. So for today's session, let me first give you a sense of what the goals are for the session, and then I'll provide an outline, which again will obviously mirror what the goals are. So first, we'll talk a bit about, I want to provide you some information about the DEI structure here at WashU School of Medicine. As you heard, our office actually is fairly young. It doesn't mean that there weren't efforts in place. So certainly want to give you a sense of what that is, as well as a bit about how we operate here at WashU, because you'll see that that will have significance in terms of the ways in which we have been able to move DEI efforts forward here in the School of Medicine. We'll talk about this comprehensive approach that we have taken to dismantling systemic racism at WashU and the precipitating factors that actually have led to the different actions. You will hear my colleague Erin Stamp talk a lot about capacity building, and that really is a foundation of the work that we do. We know we can't do it on our own. And my philosophy has been, no matter where I am, is to push DE out of my office or out of the suite into the school. And the way we do that is by building capacity. You will hear about the components of the school-wide Understanding Systemic Racism professional development curriculum that we have launched and that is now fully engaged in the school. And then you'll hear specifically about how, excuse me, our colleagues in the Department of Psychiatry here at WashU have implemented USR and are continuing to implement USR in their department. So we'll give you a bit of an introduction, again, about structure and so forth, who we are. And you'll hear about how we obtained buy-in for the Understanding Systemic Racism curriculum. And as I mentioned, you'll hear specifically about implementation in psychiatry. I suspect Erin will also be able to give you, if time allows, some sense of how some of the other departments have implemented, because you'll hear that it's happening in lots of different ways. And then we'll give you a sense of where we are with the USR curriculum, as well as next steps. And then obviously we want to have time for Q&A. And let me just mention, obviously for this session, I'm focusing a lot on USR. I am happy to respond to any questions regarding DEI at WashU. I think I know everything by heart because our site visit for LCME is next week. So I can probably spout off just about any stat that you want to know. So again, just know that we certainly can provide that information. I know that there will be an hour session after this session, and perhaps if there are questions around other topics, happy to certainly provide those. So as I mentioned, I am joined by three amazing colleagues. Erin Stamp works in my office. Erin is the Director of Programming and Professional Development here at WashU in the School of Medicine. And she is our lead on the USR curriculum, really the architect of this work, and has a passion for moving the work forward and is not afraid to take risks. That's one of the things I love about her. And then Dr. Patty Cavazos is a professor of psychiatry and also vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Department of Psychiatry. She is also a DEI liaison and an equity champion. All those words will make sense very soon. And then Dr. Neha Nafsaria is also associate professor of psychiatry here in the School of Medicine, and also a DEI liaison and an equity champion. So first, let me just give you a sense about demographics here at WashU. And I acknowledge fully upfront that diversity obviously is more than the numbers, but just to sort of ground you in terms of sort of what we look like, at least when it comes to individuals who come from populations that traditionally have been or historically excluded from medicine or biomedical science, and so as a result are underrepresented. So you can see the numbers in terms of our medical school matriculants for this year, PhD students, health profession students, master's programs, and then our trainees. So you can see residents and fellows, postdocs, our faculty and our staff. And I'll just quickly note, particularly when it comes to our faculty, we have a goal here to increase underrepresentation of faculty to at least 8% over a period of 10 years. And again, happy to talk more about that particular piece as a very specific goal that we have here in the School of Medicine. That goal actually preceded me in terms of being set, but it is one obviously that my office is very much involved in terms of moving the work forward. So to give you, again, an idea in terms of how we are organized here and structured, and I know you all have heard the saying, if you've seen one medical school, you've seen one medical school. And we have a very unique structure here. Not necessarily unique in that our dean is also the executive vice chancellor for medical affairs here at the School of Medicine. He is the only dean among the 8 deans at the School of Medicine who reports directly to the chancellor and not to the provost, because he is also the chief academic officer for the School of Medicine. So essentially the provost for the School of Medicine. And then we have a very unique structure of having what we call the executive faculty. You will hear me refer to the EF at different points in time throughout today's presentation. That is all of the department chairs in the School of Medicine. They are the governing body of our school. They actually select the dean and make that recommendation to the chancellor in terms of who should be hired. They are the decision and policy approval body of our school. And so again, you'll hear me talk about presenting to the EF on a regular basis in terms of getting approval. They actually provide support for our office, especially in the way of financial support. 65% of our funding comes from the department chairs, 35% comes from the dean. And then, of course, the dean has a senior leadership team. Along with myself, there are several other associate deans and vice chancellors who work in the dean's suite. Now let me talk about just sort of the evolution of DEI at the School of Medicine. In 1969, there was a student committee that made a recommendation to that EF body that I talked about on ways to improve the recruitment and retention of what they called underrepresented minorities at that particular time. In 1972, Dr. Robert Lee was hired to be the Assistant Dean for Minority Student Affairs and remained in that position for 20 years. And I think from what I get from my reading of sort of the history of WashU, started like so many other schools did, right? The focus was primarily on Black students in terms of getting them to medical school. And of course, now we see DEI very much expanded from that, but that certainly is the foundational work. In 1996, Will Ross became the Associate Dean for Diversity in the School of Medicine. Will is still a part of our office and on our team, and the Office of Diversity Programs then was established at that time. Now in 2015, when Dean Perlmutter became the dean of the school, he actually formed a senior leadership committee for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They were a subcommittee of that EF body that I referenced earlier. And the idea was for them to define and prioritize goals in terms of workforce diversity and increasing diversity among students and trainees. And so that body had a retreat, and out of that retreat, one of the recommendations was this idea of hiring a senior leader for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what you see on the screen were some of the priorities that they envisioned for the position that I now hold. And you can see clearly a focus, obviously, on really sort of coordinating DEI in the school, not getting in the way of people doing, but as we constantly try to do, the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing, a focus on recruitment, retention, a focus on DEI education. A lot of that was happening already through human resources, which we'll see in just a second. And then this idea of being accountable. And so having a strategic plan in terms of how to move the work forward, but also how do we measure it on a regular basis. And so the Senior Leadership Committee, along with that recommendation, then adopted some very specific metrics in terms of moving the work forward. And then also recommended universal diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all faculty, staff, and students in the school. A hiring toolkit in terms of if we're going to move recruitment forward, people need to have the tools, techniques, and practices in order to do that. They had the idea of diversity liaisons in the school. And so now every department essentially has at least one liaison, a liaison to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in terms of moving the work forward. And then they also recommended conducting a national search for a senior leader for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so in 2018, yours truly was hired, as you heard in the introduction, as the inaugural Associate Vice Chancellor for DEI, and the office was established. And so then that brought together the Office of Diversity Programs that I mentioned Will Ross currently leads and was leading for some time, as well as staff who were actually in the Human Resources Office and leading diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Erin Stamp, who you will hear from after me, was one of those leaders who is now part of our office. And so again, sort of this coming together and setting the stage for what happened. Now, I have to tell you, I was actually contacted before I even landed on campus by the Senior Associate Dean for Education to work on a project. And that was this whole idea of, and many of you I know heard about a few years ago, students at different schools who were questioning whether or not getting into AOA was fair and equitable, or whether or not it was discriminatory. And similarly, here at WashU, students were asking some of the same questions. And so one of the first projects that I worked on, talk about baptism by fire, was co-chairing a commission that looked at whether or not there was bias in clerkship grading. And we chaired that commission, myself and Steve Lawrence, a physician and faculty member here in the School of Medicine, for over a year. And we did come to the conclusion that there clearly were disparities in clerkship grading. Students' perceptions certainly were bared out in the process that we used. We made a number of recommendations, and one of those was to eliminate AOA here at WashU School of Medicine. We also have implemented a number of other factors, but again, this also began to lay sort of the foundation for the work that needed to happen. And then, of course, there was the summer of 2020, right, in terms of what happened with George Floyd. And we probably, like many of you, participated in a demonstration. So I'll show that video. And so again, pivotal, right, in lots of different ways and for in lots of different reasons. And of course, our office was contacted by different folks around the School of Medicine asking, what can we do? What can we do? And we want to read books. We want to do all these kinds of things. And Erin and I in particular wanted to take a different approach. And Erin has heard me say, probably from the time that I started, I'm kind of overdoing a town hall where nothing happens. And we wanted to actually take a different approach. And what we did was we basically began with listening sessions, and they were focused really in a restorative justice approach in terms of how does racism harm? And under Erin's leadership in particular, we trained a number of different folks to help us to facilitate those sessions. Because as you can imagine, we had lots of people signing up in terms of coming to the sessions. And we posed questions again around the harm that comes from racism. So that was one piece that happened. And we held those over a period of 3 months. Along with that, other things were happening that again were sort of pulling this all together. One of those was a commitment from the leadership here in the School of Medicine, that EF group that I talked about, the executive faculty, agreed to participate in an understanding systemic racism curriculum in August 2020. This was during COVID, and so we did it all by Zoom, but they all committed to a weekend, and so spent 16 hours on a Saturday and Sunday in this understanding systemic racism curriculum that was led by Crossroads. And even during that particular retreat was my first opportunity to introduce the idea that, again, in our office that we had been discussing around coming up with a curriculum, a professional development curriculum around understanding systemic racism. And I have to say that at that very first sort of mentioning of the USR retreat, where again, it was really just a summary because we were still working out what that would look like. It was the former chair of psychiatry who was one of the first ones to speak up. Why I love psychiatry departments. He was one of the first ones to speak up to say, I'm on board, what do we do? How do we get this going? I want it to happen in my department. And that was the kind of leadership that we needed to see for us to know that we could continue to move it forward. At the same time, the medical school was about to unveil a new curriculum, the Gateway curriculum, which one of the pieces that was different about it was that it was going to have as part of it a health equity and justice thread as part of the curriculum. And so again, sort of a pulling together of all these different factors that could make a difference in terms of moving the work forward. So in that curriculum, knowing that that would be a part of it, we were asked by the Senior Associate Dean of Education to actually provide training to the faculty and the coaches who would be part of that particular curriculum. And so some of the other contributing factors was also the composition of the EF was actually changing. Prior to 2020, we did not have any department chairs who were from populations that were underrepresented in medicine. That actually changed in 2020, where we had our first Black woman chair to join the School of Medicine as chair of OBGYN. I mentioned the Commission on Equity and Clinical Grading and the new Gateway curriculum, as well as Erin was sort of testing out different programming through the school in terms of seeing, is this going to work? What do we think? And it was sort of that shaping behavior that I remember from psychology classes, right? That we were testing out to see what people were responding to. And just very quickly, I will mention, as I said, that health equity and justice thread, because I do think it did, again, obviously played a really pivotal role. Because I'm sure many of you maybe have heard students say, oh yeah, today is diversity day for class, right? And I know that happened when I was at Iowa, where we were asked to come in 1 or 2 days. Well, with the Gateway curriculum, the hedge thread is throughout the curriculum. And so students are getting this throughout their medical school career. And so again, we wanted to align what was happening throughout the school. So we wanted to connect UME with GME, right? And we wanted to make sure that everyone was getting these different pieces. And students had that expectation as well, that if we're getting this work and if we're getting this knowledge, we also want to know that our faculty too are getting the same. And so as we continue to work through our office on the Understanding Systemic Racism curriculum, it was then time to go to the EF and to get their approval on a couple of different things. One was we wanted a commitment to them to anti-racism, and I will show you that slide in just a second. And we wanted to get their commitment to the Understanding Systemic Racism professional development curriculum, as well as a commitment to provide support for faculty in particular. It could be staff also, but faculty in particular and their departments to serve as equity champions to move the work forward. Again, I won't go into detail about the equity champions because Erin will cover that in just a second. And so went to the EF. I go to their meetings all the time, but in this particular case, it was actually to present, and they said yes. And I remember after the meeting, I went to Erin, I was like, I guess we're doing this. I was kind of expecting we need to think about it, come back in a month, but it was like, okay, we're ready to go. And so then that spurred the work, spurred us obviously to continue to move the work forward. So my last slide before I turn it over to Erin is to show you the anti-racism commitment statement that was approved by our executive faculty. And it is not just a statement, as you'll hear from Erin. We really try to operationalize the statement in lots of different ways in the school. We actually hold sessions around what the statement means because we want people to understand that. And so they made that commitment again, along with the commitment to the Understanding Systemic Racism curriculum. And so I will stop there, and I want to now transition to Erin Stamp. And Erin, please feel free to share any information about you that you want everyone to know about your awesomeness.
Okay, thank you so much. I will pull up my slides here. And just say, you know, again, reiterate our excitement and what an honor it is to be with you all today. I actually got my master's in public policy at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and have a dear friend that works at your wonderful institution. So if it wasn't for my family being in St. Louis, I'd probably still be in Baltimore. So just really cool to be with some family today. Yes, my name is Erin Stamp. I use she, her pronouns. I've been doing this work for the work of equity, justice, diversity, inclusion for past over 20 years now, mostly in undergraduate education. And it's been just really an amazing kind of step in my career to get to move into academic medicine. And I have just found it to be so incredibly rewarding given the impact that we can really make. And particularly in the region where we are, St. Louis, Missouri. We are a region that is in such need of healing, but is also just brilliant and so intimately understands these issues. So we've been able to take some frameworks from our community that are originated in our community and apply them to this work. So I can't see anybody anymore. So I'm just making sure my slides are up. You can see me. You can see my slides, right? Sure, we're good. Okay, cool. All right. So you'll see my template kind of moves back and forth from our understanding systemic racism template to our office template. I kind of just was giving you an idea of what it looks like a little bit. And so how I wanted to spend my time, there's so much we could say. And thank you, Cherie, for such an awesome introduction and laying of the foundation. Can't iterate enough how important it's been to have Cherie's leadership. I think maybe what she said about me taking risk is one of the things she loves about me, is maybe my favorite kind of introductory statement ever. And so that I take that as an honor, and you really have to have leaders that will support you in doing that. And something that Cherie did early on in the process when we wanted to have the How Racism Harms listening sessions that I'll talk about a little more in a minute. We said we don't want to do more harm, right? And so we had to ask people to identify as white or BIPOC so that we could create shared identity space in these listening sessions. And that's something that I had tried to do a few years earlier and didn't have the support. And so Cherie saying, let's do it, let's try it and see how it goes, was really paramount in terms of the culture change that we are trying to lead at our institution. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a couple of the culture change framework that we use that really guides sort of all of our programming and professional development, keeping in mind that that is essentially our office's kind of main goal. We do it in different ways: recruitment, retention, right, education, but ultimately it's about how do we create a culture that is different and that allows for people to come fully as who they are, and really centers truth-telling, reconciliation, these things. So wanted to show you the framework that guides sort of how I developed this program, and then walk you through, just tell you a little bit more about the equity champion role, and then a little bit about our USR curriculum, and then we'll pass it on to Patty and Neha, and of course we'll answer questions later. So just kind of wanted to let you know what my piece would be about. So this phases of culture change model is really, really simple on purpose. And it really started with the Forward Through Ferguson, a nonprofit organization here in St. Louis. After Michael Brown was killed, the Ferguson Commission was created. This is in 2014. And this amazing group of people in our community created the Ferguson Commission report that had 149 action items for getting to racial equity in St. Louis. One of the tools that came out of that was a phases of culture change model that looks a lot like this, that is really this, except for that here at WashU, we added the sustaining column, because we know as we do this work that progress and retrenchment is real, that we will make some strides forward, and inevitably dominant culture pushes us back and asks us to go backwards. And so we added this lane of sustaining the work, because we're going to do a lot of hard work. How can we make it really stick? And so this framework, like I said, really guides a lot of our work. And so when we think about culture, when we're using this framework, we're really thinking about, it can be US context. For us, it's St. Louis. we think about our institution, obviously that is Washington University School of Medicine, but also then when we're working with departments, you can think about psychiatry as a particular kind of subculture of the institution. And then of course, individual is each of us that makes up all of these things. And so want to show you an example or kind of walk you through how we're using this framework in terms of the education that we're talking to you about today. So the first phase being awareness, right? Being aware that there is a problem and something needs to change. And so our diversity, equity, inclusion 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are foundational trainings that we offer and have since 2015, updated them again in 2020, working on updating them always, but they are really foundational and they help with the socialization process that you all are aware is so important when we're learning new things, when we're trying to create change, when we're understanding, when we're creating our culture. Having these kind of foundational pieces are really important. And so in those, we give some shared language. We define diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusive excellence. We talk about implicit bias. We talk about microaggressions and upstanding, how to be an upstander. And then our 4.0 is really cases where we kind of practice some of those concepts. So that's really socializing our community into that this is important to us. And we are in healthcare and inequities persist. So we have a responsibility to do something about that, both for the people we take care of, our patients and families, as well as our colleagues, our coworkers, the people that create the institution. Then we get into kind of the understanding. So now we're aware there's an issue. We have to really have a depth of understanding of what it is to be able to do work for transformation. And a lot of times, I don't know if you all hear about this, those that work on the diversity, anything diversity, equity, and inclusion, people will say like, why do we got to move beyond talking? We understand that giving people a place to talk and be in community is foundationally important because oftentimes people want to jump to what can I do? Well, you need to understand what we're talking about before you can do anything that's really transformative, right? So our How Racism Harms listening sessions that Cherie mentioned were kind of our response to the murder of George Floyd, as well as COVID-19 and some of the xenophobia that was happening because of COVID-19 and some of the language of our country's leader at the time. And so we felt like we really needed to make some space for people. And like Cherie said, we didn't want to just do a statement that says we stand in solidarity. We didn't want to just create space for people to, either be exhausted or surprised, depending on identity and experience, right? So we wanted to take a different approach. And one of the other frameworks that we use in our curriculum is restorative justice and academic medicine. So that's kind of two frameworks I'm offering in terms of just takeaways is the phases of culture change, and then a restorative justice framework, which really focuses on truth, reconciliation, harm, and reduction of harm, right? And so these How Racism Harm listening sessions were really to get our community to say the words, Black people, BIPOC people, racism is real, and I see it in this way, I'm impacted in this way. And so that's where we did shared identity space. We came together in the beginning, we kind of laid the foundation for creating a supportive space, and then we would go into breakout rooms with groups with people who identify as white and white facilitators, and people who identify as BIPOC and BIPOC facilitators, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. For anyone who, I know acronyms can sometimes be, there's a lot of acronyms in our life, so I thought it was important to say that. And then we would go through the 4 harm questions about what is the harm, who causes it, what is the harm, who is impacted by it, how do we repair it? Who is responsible? And then at the end of the sessions, we would come back together and ask for the groups to share, what do you want the other group to know? So people could remain anonymous, but there could still be learning across identities and experiences. So that helped shape understanding. As Cherie mentioned, she shared the community the leadership commitment to anti-racism, and we began socializing this idea, this commitment, and the concepts within it through our community discussions on the actual statement. We talked about the very specific, what was different about this statement was it was a call to action. We committed in the statement to saying we're going to do medical education and professional development differently here. We're going to find inequities by race and work to dismantle them in our institution. And so we were socializing these concepts, race as a social construct, right? What does that mean to you? How do you think it impacts your work? And just kind of moving people along. When we get into transforming, that's where the work starts to be different, where we take deeper dives in education, and we're asking people to really show up in a different way. So one of the examples is we have a witnessing whiteness program where it's people who identify as white, digging into what white identity means, what supremacy thinking looks like, and some action planning around being a white anti-racist. And then what we're here to mainly talk about, understanding systemic racism, and then we're getting into transforming and sustaining with some of the tools that we give in this curriculum. For example, an equity tool for our leadership track in particular, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's a tool, it's essentially a list of questions that when you're reviewing policy processes, making decisions, you have this tool that reminds you to think about things in a different way. Who isn't at the table? Who's most impacted? Why aren't they at the table if they're the most impacted by this policy, right? And then, of course, the equity champions, which I'll talk about next, which is really that capacity building strategy that Cherie mentioned. And so that gets us into both transforming the way we're thinking, what we can see, where our understanding systemic racism curriculum is really trying to get people to be able to see racism at work in our work environment, be able to name it, have some language and some tools for addressing it. And then, of course, the work doesn't stop at education. It's about how do you take it now and apply it in your corner of the institution through policy review, changes in practice, things like that. And that's where we get into the sustaining part. I see there's chats. Am I missing anything? Okay, cool. Just want to make sure that, oh, great. I'm not surprised to hear that Maryland is, that you all have some frameworks around restorative justice. Okay, so. Oh, and then the last one, restorative justice in academic medicine. I always forget, I put that one there. And that's, sorry, but for the culture change piece, I think this is what's really important. When we think about the success that we've had, it's been a lot about socializing, getting buy-in from people across the board, socializing, giving language, increasing people's comfortability, because ultimately when we get to transforming and sustaining, that's where the hard part comes in. When we're thinking about a restorative approach, it's very different than a punitive approach, right? To bias and, responding to bias reports and things like that. So when we're thinking about applying an equity lens to a policy that's been long-standing, there's going to be hard conversations. And so the other piece about this is the importance of relationship. This work is so fundamentally relational, which I'm sure you all understand. But and that's a really good segue into my favorite part of the program, which is equity champions. And it was a key part of our strategy to build the capacity. We want to see ourselves, our office and our team as really leading and giving the tools, but working with our partners across the institution, as Cherie said, getting it out of the C-suite and into the institution, but doing so in alignment. So often what gets in our way is that we've got different people doing lots of different things around DEI, but because resources are limited, we don't get that traction that we need for culture change. And so the idea of this model was to change culture in our approach, right? So the first kind of culture change, if you will, is that we asked for committed time and effort from departmental leadership. That we can't continue to ask DEI work to be voluntary. Cherie is always good at reminding us about the culture and cultural or minority tax, that so often it's women and folks of color who are tapped to lead this work in their spare time, right? And so we're really looking for ways to compensate people for their time. You know, when we have a panel of leaders come in from our community, we give them a stipend. And we want, if the department is committed to this change and the time it's going to take, we want people to be able to have the time to give to it. And so that was, I think, maybe one of the things we were most nervous about asking for support on, but they said yes, right? So, and what that looks like, we can get into later with questions, but obviously it's very different for different departments. Some people have dedicated, you know, a title and a time, and other people have been given time just as an equity champion. And I will say that, you know, while we can't mandate how departments decide to do it, we're in partnership, we can preserve the integrity of the program. And so I always like to give an example here. With the first equity champion program, we had, well, first of all, let me back up. In our application to be an equity champion, we actually ask for a letter of support from your supervisor so that we know you've had the conversation and that they understand that you're going to be dedicating time. What that looks like between you all is key. But one of our equity champions had gotten a letter of support and had texted me the night before and said, hey, my department's asking me to take vacation for the week-long equity champion training. And I said, you know, with all due respect, we really want to have you, but that's not how this program is designed. So it needs to be that you would participate on work time. I can't support you taking a whole week of vacation for this. That's kind of going against the model. I can reach out to your leaders and tell them, you know, that we appreciate their interest. And when they're ready, we'll be here. And I did a very, you know, thoughtfully crafted email to their leaders, and they were like, okay, we understand. And the person was able to participate on work time, right? So these are small ways in which we're trying to kind of push for the importance of time in this work. Next is that we kind of the key tasks for this role is that departments know their area. And so we want to work with them to say, what's the best way to roll this out? Our curriculum is several hours and it's tailored by track depending on role. And so we really wanted to have insight in partnership with the departments. You can see the tailoring of curricular content because we really want it to be relevant and applicable. And in our environments, we have such different we have a diversity of environments. We have labs, we have business units, we have facilities, we have clinical areas, you know, so we know that we have to tailor the education. And then of course, not all of our equity champions will end up co-facilitating. Some are very interested and very excited about it. Some are like, please don't make me get up in front of people, but I'll be the strategy behind it. And so we're really working with folks. But the idea is that for the capacity piece in terms of delivering this training across campus, that we would have some co-facilitation with our equity champions. And then once the implementation happens, they help lead action planning, policy review, procedure review. What are our interventions going to be? Where are the inequities in our department that we need to address? So here's a quick picture of our first cohort in which Patty and Neha were there. See, there they are. Hi, you can't see with the masks, but just putting some humans to the process. And just very quickly wanted to let you know some of the things that we learned. That 90% of folks said that they gain confidence in their ability to discuss systemic racism. This is huge. We can't address things that we don't know how to talk about, right? That's one of the fundamental changes we have to make. And so that was a great learning. 75% said that they felt somewhat prepared to lead discussions. And here's the great thing about the model. So equity champions go through a week-long training with a cohort. And then we have monthly meetings. So we're building ongoing community and support. And then we also do one-on-one consultations to develop their action plan, their implementation plan, and then to do the curricular tailoring, the content tailoring. So what I wanted to mostly highlight is this right here. They most valued the community that was created. We've heard that over and over and over. Ultimately, this is coalition community capacity building. And we have been overwhelmed by how much other and having this community of support in the work. I can't overstate that. Again, this work is relational. It's much easier to call you in about something when we have a mutually respectful relationship. And then, of course, just a couple of really cool quotes about because I don't know about you, but getting a week with people in academic medicine is pretty revolutionary in and of itself. And they loved it. They were tired, but they loved it. And so they said things like, I've been waiting my entire career to be in a room like this with people doing this work, and hands down the most meaningful and attention grabbing in my career. So just really pleased and proud of the experience we're creating. And so kind of where we are currently, we have done 3 week-long cohort trainings. We have 47 champions trained. So 14 of our 22 departments have equity champions. And 2 of our allied health programs, 1 center, our Excitement Cancer Center, has 3 equity champions. And the breakdown is 19 faculty and 28 staff. So really having an equity focused approach that we want to have people at all levels of the institution involved in this and presenting, because people like to hear from their peers, right? So staff also like to hear from staff who they feel like they can identify with. Trying to check on time. I'm going to just really quickly, guys, I want you to hear from Patty and Neha. But so this is the path, the learning path that we created, and are giving this to our equity champions to help socialize with their departments about the journey we're taking people on. One of the kind of bumps in the road has been that we want people to take 1 through 4. And I say bumps, not a big one, but this has been a culture change for us that we said, no, it's a prerequisite. You know, we've had 1 through 4 on campus for 7 years. If you've never attended those trainings, we really don't want to start with understanding systemic racism, right? We start with adding and subtraction in math, not trigonometry. We're going to start with some basic language and skills, and then we'll move into the more challenging topics for the betterment of the work, right, to set us all up for success. So you can see we have the 1 through 4, the how racism harm listening sessions, those community discussions about the statement, and then moving into our understanding systemic racism curriculum. So I know this is busy. I don't love this slide, but we did have to create some kind of graphics to help people get an idea of what we meant by this curriculum is tailored by tracks. And so anybody on campus has the option, if they want, to go through all of the curriculum. Like if a group decides we don't just want our leaders to get the whole thing, we want everybody to get it, we are more than happy to do that. And we understand that particularly with groups like residents, time is precious and harder to come by. And so sometimes depends on the layout. But we wanted to have a curriculum that was structured enough, but also flexible enough for the various needs of our environment. And so kind of the main thing that I want you to take away from this is that we have some very foundational stuff that we want everybody to get. Why are we starting with race, language, and key concepts? The timeline of our desegregation of our medical campus to give really a historical context and bring some of the language that we teach alive. People make it more tangible. Identity, personal identity reflection, and race as a social construct. And so we want everyone, regardless of role, to get those foundational pieces for that culture change, this common language and values. But then, of course, we want to tailor the other sessions and some of the other learnings and tools for people based on their role. So you see with, and this flips it a little bit too, in that we ask for leaders to do more, right? Because leaders are the ones that really have such an influence over culture. And so we're asking leaders to and in many of our rollouts, so far, actually, all of our rollouts, we've started with leaders. And then we're kind of tearing it down, which is really great because when we rolled out 1 through 4, we heard a lot of, are my leaders going to get this? So we're starting with the people that have such an influence on culture. So a big one here I talked about is that equity tool and action planning, that's a session that we do with our leaders to make sure that they are having, moving out of the curriculum with next steps. And then we have these different roles. What I didn't make a slide for, but I think is important to mention, is we created a Understanding Systemic Racism committee, curriculum committee, and it was representative of all what you see in these tracks. We had people from our preclinical areas, our clinical areas, staff, faculty, and just really, and people who have been leading training programs, so that we were able to have voices represented in terms of what is needed. It's not advancing. Okay, here we go. So last two things here are, I just wanted to throw up that another framework we're using is this compassion continuum. And again, we can talk in the later hours about, or the later hour about why that's important, but wanted to give you a taste of the curriculum, which is helping us really understand the difference between pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion, and moving people towards empathy and compassion. I put this up because I've actually heard from clinical faculty that it's one of their favorite tools because it's very tangible. And it's hard to do anti-racism work from a place of pity. You actually can't. So, and then the other piece was, I know that's a lot of words on the screen, but we kind of start the conversation to be, I think what's really important about our curriculum too, is we're trying to be very transparent and honest about where we come from, that we are in fact not neutral, that we are biased towards anti-racism and equity, and that's the journey we're taking people on and getting them a chance to react to that. So we borrow from Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist book that really names that neutrality is, we don't have a place for neutrality in this work. And then another busy slide for you, but this is kind of where we're at in terms of all of our reach. We've got these different departments, the different centers I mentioned, even some of our hospital partners have attended Equity Champion training. And then kind of this is the pathway, and you can see that we're in different places in terms of moving it forward. And it's been really fun to see how different people implement this. I think I'll stop there. I have a slide about lessons learned, but we'll wait and see if we have time, because I really want you to hear from my amazing colleagues and co-partners here, Patty and Neha. They have really made this vision come to life, and I'm just really grateful to get to work with them. Thanks.
Okay, so I just want to echo my appreciation for inviting us here today. It's such an honor to be presenting, this curriculum, this implementation that we did in psychiatry, and of course to be presenting alongside with my amazing colleagues, Neha, Erin, and Cherie. So thank you for having us here. I am Patty Cavazos. I'm a professor of psychiatry at WashU Medical School. I'm also the vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Department of Psychiatry. Erin talked a bit about the Equity Champion training that I went through. I was one of the first cohort to go through the training. Also a DEI liaison, which means I get to interact pretty regularly with other leaders across our institution who are also, moving, uplifting DEI. My full-time job is I'm an NIH-funded researcher. We have a pretty heavy research department. Clinical work is a huge priority, as is education and research. So those are the pillars of our department in psychiatry. I'm also a co-director for various early career research training programs at WashU. One of those is a NIH-funded mental health disparity training program for URIM. So that I'm very proud of, and I'm also an inaugural co-director for a Proud Med program, which is newly implemented at the medical school to help URIM across various departments and divisions at our med school. So that's exciting. And then I've been teaching health disparities course at the med school for over 15 years or so. So that's a little bit of background about myself. And Neha, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself really quickly and introduce yourself, and then I'll go into the rest of the slides.
Hi, everyone. My name is Neha Nafsaria. Again, just echoing Patty's comments. We are so excited to be here and to be sharing this information with all of you and looking forward to the conversation as well. I think so much of DEI work is about just continuing the conversations and keep them moving along. As both Cherie and Patty had mentioned, my role with the department. So I'm a licensed psychologist, and I work specifically with the Division of Child Psychiatry within our department. And I have the roles of being the DEI lead for our division and also an equity champion and DEI liaison, which those roles have been talked about. A lot of my role is primarily in clinical and in teaching work, so and training. So my interests are in young child mental health and parenting and interventions along those lines. And then I also co-direct our psychotherapy training program for our child psychiatry fellows. And in general, I've had a longstanding interest in ethnic minority and immigrant mental health and really looking at ethnic and racial identity development. Myself, I'm the daughter of South Asian American immigrants, so a lot of that came from that. And also grew up in the Northeast in New York City, spent a lot of time in Philadelphia and the Baltimore area before moving to the Midwest, and been in St. Louis for the last 12 years. And I share all of that because so much of our understanding of DEI work is really influenced too. That lens is influenced by our identities and our lived experiences. And even just being in the Northeast and then shifting to the Midwest, eye-opening things for me in that process as well. And I've spent a lot of time with a lot of active roles in the Asian American Psychological Association. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of how that's influenced some of this work and the importance of being part of those groups as well when I talk in a few slides.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and cover just a little bit about the demographics of our department. So you can see over time, we've been relatively consistent in terms of having about 11% URIM and across our faculty, and staff is pretty comparable to this. Right, our benchmark at the med school is 8%, so we're doing pretty good in psychiatry, although we definitely need to do better. Our Black African American psychiatry faculty, you can see the percent. We have about over 100 or so faculty members in total in psychiatry. So currently about 2% are Black African American. And then for Hispanic Latino faculty, we went up a bit, and unfortunately it looks like our numbers are going down. So we're at about close to 6% Hispanic Latino faculty. Our multiracial URIM faculty members, you can see here we're at currently at about 3%. On a positive note, we have a lot of a lot of women faculty members. So you can see that currently over half of our psychiatry faculty identify as women. So I'm going to talk about the USR implementation, and we started off the rollout with our residents and fellows. So the step one of implementation was really preparing our trainees that this USR, the Understanding Systemic Racism curriculum, is coming. So when there was an orientation during summer, Neha and I joined the orientation. We talked about ourselves and the curriculum to let them know that this training was going to be coming soon in the next few months. Then the step two is the actual implementation. So we, for the first time ever, integrated this curriculum into the psychiatry residence lecture series starting in fall of 2022. We did this in partnership with our Office of DEI, and then me and Neha attended every session with Dr. Pittman from the ODEI, and we facilitated the sessions. We have about 40 residents who take part in this USR lecture once per month. Each lecture is about an hour long. We've had 6 USR lectures to date, split them between the fall and the spring. And we're planning actually to start next week having an even deeper dive with our advanced residents. We'll have about 4 sessions with the advanced residents to have a lot more opportunities for discussion and higher level conversations and lectures too. We also rolled this out with the psychiatry fellows. They had been receiving some DEI didactics prior to 2022, and Neha was leading those sessions. And then we went ahead and integrated the USR curriculum. And again, same facilitators with Dr. Pittman from the Office of DEI and myself and Neha. And so this entails about 10 fellows who take part in the lectures. The lectures sometimes go a little bit longer, where it's 1 to 2 hours. And there's a plan to integrate more child-focused content within the 2-year curriculum, as these are all child psychiatry fellows. You can see here, we're very proud of the implementation. We take pictures and we update our department on the implementation. And this is Jess Pittman at the front leading the discussion with our psychiatry residents. And then here are the fellows, where they're receiving even some tailored curriculum. There are various faculty members that are invited who have an interest in DEI to also help with the implementation of the curriculum. And so we have, for this session, a faculty member who was giving a timeline of psychiatry and USR. So again, tailoring some of the components, leveraging the content from the Office of DEI. So the next step I'll talk about, really quickly in the interest of time, is the evaluation. We also think it's very important to collect data. We got data from our residents, and the blue dots represent various lectures that the residents are receiving, and what's bolded in the yellow are the USR trainings that they received. And so on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being excellent, on average, our lectures are rated very highly, about a 4.5. So, and this is in comparison to the other lectures that have been ongoing. So we're really excited to see these scores. We also surveyed our residents, and you can see here, again, high percentages of our residents saying that the curriculum has been impactful. They're motivated to take action on issues surrounding DEI. And the majority of residents also said that it's motivated to give them thoughts to issues surrounding DEI and also social justice. And I should note that we also had fellows complete this survey, so some of these responses are also coming from the fellows as well. Again, very excited to see these data. And so some of the qualitative quotes that have come from our trainees, this one in the middle, the anti-racism lecture series is phenomenal. I appreciate the history review. I love how the larger natural history is connected to events at St. Louis and Barnes. This concepts have played close to home. It increases our accountability. Everyone at BJH, that's our hospital, and at Washington University should see this lecture. So very powerful data that we're receiving from our trainees. We're also preparing for the scale up our department-wide implementation, because we know we need to impact and have faculty and staff go through these USR curriculum. So as Jess indicated earlier, we are starting with a foundation for the DEI trainings. We've actually trained our faculty and staff in DEI 1 through 4 to get them ready for their USR implementation. We had over 200 employees attend DEI training. And this, again, was in partnership with ODEI. So, very excited to be rolling this out and preparing our entire department for the USR curriculum. We also prepare our department by giving updates about DEI and the USR curriculum in monthly newsletters. We're letting folks know about the DEI trainings. If they miss it, we give them alternative dates where they can participate. You can see here, there's the picture again with the residents, so that we're letting our department know our trainees are already going through USR curriculum, and that, hey, faculty and staff, you all are next. So, be prepped for that. And then we're also providing updates about DEI, across the campus, our community, and beyond. And this is a monthly newsletter that we send out. Used to come from Neha and I, and now our department chair is very enthusiastic about this, and it's coming now from his desk, where we, include all of the content, and then it comes directly from his desk. So that's exciting too. Another thing that I'm a part of is our leadership meetings, where we have our department head, who's pictured there on the left. So we meet with the vice chairs in psychiatry, give them updates, have them, kind of keeping their buy-in, but also asking for their advice on how to implement USR across the department. We have about 600 employees in total in psychiatry. So this is a big thing that we're doing. So it's a matter of kind of planning this out very intentionally and carefully. As I mentioned, I also, Neha and I, both of us meet with other DEI leadership across our institution to think about best practices. And then we meet very closely and partner very closely with our Office of DEI, folks like Erin Stamp and Jess Pittman, Jeremiah Ori, and then also Cherie Wilson to talk about best practice for implementation across our department. Some of the key ingredients that we've found that led to our success is, as Cherie mentioned earlier, we had a lot of department head buy-in from the very beginning, a lot of support and encouragement. We now have a new department head who is equally enthusiastic. So that was critical, is really to have our department chair and the institution at large being enthusiastic about this curriculum. Neha and I were the ones to take part in the Equity Champion training, which I'm so appreciative of. So that was kind of a second step, is for us to really be involved and know exactly what it is and how do we implement, et cetera. We listened to the suggestions from Office of DEI. So Erin hinted that maybe starting with trainees is a good way to go because they're likely very ready, while at the same time we need to teach our foundation DEI to our faculty and staff to get them ready, right? So we just kind of need to move this forward. We pushed implementation, meaning that it's not a perfect program yet, but nevertheless, we're going to roll it out. We're going to get feedback. We're going to improve, et cetera. So that was big too. And then again, kind of updating consistently our leadership, our department head, the other vice chairs, clinical directors, always going to getting their feedback. It's an iterative process where we're, again, kind of working to implement and improve. We collect the evaluation data, which I love because it helps to validate the relevance of this curriculum. And then we're also communicating very closely with other DEI leaders at our institution, again, to figure out the best way to do this and what works and what doesn't work. And I'll turn this over to Neha, and you can talk about these last few slides.
And Patty, if you can just click like 2 or 3 ahead, just to get the animations up, thanks. So much of this was about the communication. Like it's not just, okay, we're part of this Equity Champion program and we have a curriculum, but it was Patty and I really thinking about how we roll out the communication of this to our department, because so much of this is about behavioral change. And I think in some sense, being in psychiatry, being in the discipline of psychotherapy, it's sort of being aware of culture change around this is not something that happens overnight. And it's really important to think about how do we create culture change across our department. So this was a slide that I had presented. Patty and I did a presentation about a year ago to our department, where when Patty became vice chair, one of her first initiatives was collecting a DEI climate survey and presenting that data to the department. And then from that data, we were able to also talk about issues that were going on, but then to introduce what are we going to do to start addressing this? And it was the perfect fit and time to talk about the Understanding Systemic Racism curriculum. And this was probably about a year before we even started implementing with the residents and fellows, and then definitely longer before implementing it to faculty and staff. So one of the things I wanted to communicate to everyone was the sort of the history of DEI work, like where it's been and where we're going. So very quickly, the purpose of this slide was to say that, traditionally, the DEI work, and I'd first introduced the D and the I and talked about the fact that this started out originally as more diversity work, then inclusion was added, and then equity was added, and to even just talk about the evolution of that work. And that historically, a lot of times DEI has been in the context of, the diversity committee. I mean, if you look at what Cherie presented about the history of DEI work at the School of Medicine, it started out as sort of like these special interest groups in various, not just med schools, but various departments, organizations, associations. And I remember being part of those. And it was exciting because you found folks who were interested in that same work. And the positives of that, because I definitely don't want to minimize the efforts of these groups, because those are groups, like as an example, I was part of the Asian American Psychological Association, and those are groups that really empowered me into doing a lot of the work that I'm doing today, and also giving you access to mentorship that you maybe would not have otherwise found. What's, I think, the difficulty with having that set up is that then it only kind of affects sort of, you know, those two circles around you, that the people who are, you know, in close affinity to those groups or close proximity to those groups. And we want to think about this as what structural change can happen that can impact the whole group, the whole department. So if we go to the next slide, we focus on, and then Patty, you can just click a few ahead, about what are the structures that need to start happening and what are the structures that happen in our department. So as was mentioned early on, our previous department chair, Chuck Zaromsky, he was very supportive in collaborating with our Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. And then he also created Patty's role, the vice chair of DEI, which was very important and communicated a lot to the rest of the department. And then from that, and Patty, if you just click one or two ahead, there were the equity champion roles that were started by the DEI office in the training. And so placing those roles and DEI liaison roles in departments sort of begins to spread that DEI work. And if you remember earlier that Cherie talked about, you know, the ultimate goal for DEI work is to push it out of the Office of DEI and to have it sort of woven into everything that we're doing. And you know, slowly over time, just in reflecting on the last 2 years of implementing this in psychiatry, we're starting to see that more people at different levels, they have a shared language. They're beginning to talk about these things more, that it's not sort of housed in, you know, the committee that does that group and that's their special interest. It's more that this is part of what everybody should be doing in the good practice of medicine. And that's what we've seen. And even with our department head, as Patty said, that he's being accountable and having the DEI newsletter come from his office, and you know, we are contributing in part of it. But even the messaging around what he is saying, and even when in Cherie's role, where she's meeting with the chairs of various departments, she can see that in her conversations with him as well, that he's having these conversations and that DEI is, you know, the cycle of how it's being discussed is sort of woven into everything. And then the last slide, just I wanted to unpack the communication, sort of the ingredients of communication about DEI a little bit more, that so much of it is about transparency, and in those communications, talking about our commitment and our accountability. I think with the transparency piece, one thing that we talked about in the beginning was showing those two slides that I just shared with you. But then as we introduced the curriculum, it wasn't just introduced as this is something that everybody is required to do. We explained why it was needed, what's being addressed, but also explained where it fit. And so that slide that Erin had shared about the 4 phases and that roadmap, that was a very important slide to share. And this is what I've enjoyed so much about the partnership that we've had, is that their office has created these resources for us, that it was important to say we're doing this and it fits in this broader roadmap. And that's an important piece to a lot of what we're doing, because in the past, sometimes we've had maybe a diversity lecture or one diversity requirement, and it's often been presented as this requirement that you have to do, and it's kind of out of context of this broader scope. And so it was very important to explain to everybody, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and when it's going to happen, and where you all fit in. And as Patty alluded to, was also kind of saying, hey, and the residents and the fellows, they're going to be doing this soon. And we're going to have you guys do this to establish your readiness, and you don't want to be, you know, left out. And we didn't say it that way, but it's how it's sort of presented, that we're just continually reminding everybody of this. So it's not a surprise. People aren't questioning, you know, what is the purpose of this curriculum. And then again, having the resources of our DEI office being consistent with our communications. We've already talked about the partnership that we greatly appreciate Cherie Wilson in her office, and Erin and Jess Pittman for a lot of the work that they do. And, you know, really the how and the who and the when of the messaging, we've often asked our chair to reinforce a lot of things that we are saying, because it is important. It is important when things come from the top and when that communication comes from the top. And our current chair, Eric Lenz, has just been fabulous with all of that. So I think I will pass it back to Cherie.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. A couple of things before we get to Q&A. One is in terms of next steps and where we're going, and really building on what Neha just talked about. The idea of, we're hearing now from our leaders, our department chairs, we're hearing them using some of the same language that we are using, which is wonderful. In our last cohort, we did have one of our chairs who actually wanted to go through the equity champion training himself. And now I know I've been in meetings, Aaron's been in some of those same meetings with me, and he's like talking about what we're doing in our office and we need to be supported. I'm like, I love it. Keep doing it. Keep saying it. And so to hear those words, and because you can tell that it really is making an impact, not just from the bottom up, but from top down, which we know is significant. Our next cohort for our equity champions will actually be in April. So we'll have a new cohort coming in, and Aaron talked about people have to apply to become an equity champion. We review the application. There does need to be a commitment. It is a 2-year commitment that we ask people to make, and that the departments obviously commit to in terms of covering the FTE for those particular pieces. So I'll stop there and see what questions that we can answer for you. I think that we are able to go until 12:30, correct, Dr. Forster?
Yeah, it's 1:30 here, but yes.
Okay, yeah, sorry, 12:30 my time, yes.
So I want to say thank you for a tremendous presentation. For everybody who's still on, I saw Dr. Wilson and her crew, not everybody in this group. I think Aaron, you were there at the AAMC meeting. And I was so struck by the cohesiveness that I felt like it was important for us to hear that messaging. I've put in the Zoom link for the session that's going to start at 1:30, but we already have some questions in the chat. The first question was, can you, when doing the evaluations of the curriculum and the programming, how do you control for participants' social desirability bias when they're completing the surveys?
Yeah, I mean, the surveys are anonymous, right? So we send out a link. I sent it to all of the trainees and let them know it's anonymous. So they're not completing this, I mean, I'd like for them, actually, the final evaluation, I would like to do for them to complete the survey while we have them, because that might help, give them a few minutes to complete the survey versus us emailing it to them and then they don't, it just kind of gets lost in an inbox. Mm-hmm. But, in terms of like them giving feedback, it has all been anonymous. And you can kind of see from, the first slide that I showed with the evaluation, not all of the lectures are being rated highly, right? I mean, that's kind of, I'm not a training director, but I think that would catch my eye, is there is some fluctuation there. So I feel like residents are being kind of honest, with their ratings. And actually, the trainees are very outspoken about various things in our department that need to be improved. So if anything, I would say that they're, and it's impressive. They should feel comfortable to speak openly about various things that need improvement. So that's kind of been my impression of our trainees. Is the other end of it is where they're like really feeling okay about, wanting to see improvements in various areas. So yeah, but I mean, as a researcher, I am mindful about social desirability. It is a possibility. I just, again, kind of seeing what the data is showing. Not everything is like all great. So that kind of tells me with that variability, there's likely to be some residents or some trainees who are being very honest about what they like and don't like in our training program.
Thank you. The next question is, would you be willing to share the Understanding Systemic Racism lecture topics and lectures that are given to the psychiatry residents?
I think it's an ODEI question, so I'm going to punt that one.
Cherie, do you want me to take that?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I will say, and it's kind of to bridge these two questions. one thing that we've been very transparent about is that there's been a bit of a building the plane while flying it happening. Like Cherie mentioned, it was like they said yes. And we were like, oh, okay. So we have this proposal, we know what we're doing, but like, it's a whole lot of work to implement it. And one of the things that has really struck me is that I didn't really plan for is our time with equity champions, right? It's really takes time to build the relationship, to do the training, to do the consulting and provide the support. And so with that, we have really asked for honest feedback, and our equity champions also don't tend to hold back. Like, this is great. This is what we need from you, and we've tried to adjust along the way. And been very transparent about feedback being really important for us, critical feedback, because we know it isn't perfect and we want to constantly be enhancing our work. That's one of the beautiful things I think about equity and inclusion work, is you're always able to say like, oh, we learned more, and we model curiosity and constant learning by shaping our curriculum as we learn more. And so I will say that I have been remiss in not getting this published. What we want to do is actually get it documented in terms of, I think what stands out about our model is the equity champion role. And so we kind of want to write about that, and then the tailored tracks. And then we would be very happy to share that information. So, and it will be done soon. I've got a couple places I'm looking to submit to, and we've finally started a little bit of writing. So that should be done here hopefully in the next few months.
We're also working on copyright. So once that's going to be, then we'll be more than happy to share more info.
Yes.
And copywriting your intellectual property is very, very important in the DEI space. And so I fully appreciate you all taking the steps to do that so it could be rolled out on the larger stage. Dr. Gordon has her hand up.
Yeah, I think it's probably more of a comment and a question at the same time. So here at University of Maryland, we also have folks who've been working on curriculum development around anti-racism and structural competency. And I really enjoyed that you guys included Helena Hansen and Jonathan Metzel, which are sentinel pieces to read. I'm just wondering, in your research and developing your curriculum, what sort of resources that you use? I know many of universities are actually developing their anti-racism curriculum, and there was a movement prior to COVID on anti-racism curriculum, and I think there was like 3 model schools who were publishing their work and kind of sharing what they were doing, and some of those people are esteemed peers of mine. I'm just wondering, like in the space of DEI, where much of the content area is very similar, no matter where you are, how do we, I guess, share these resources equitably, but also, again, with the intellectual property and that sort of thing? What was you guys thinking about sharing? Because I get that a lot. People ask me, can you share your curriculum? And I'm like, well, it took a lot of work and effort. It's a little bit harmful to me to just share this and then someone else get credit for the work that we do. But I wonder if there's resources that you think are things that you would share and feel comfortable sharing with folks who are developing curriculum, and what would be the place that you would share those resources? I guess, because I think there's a bunch of people who are program directors in the same boat. Like, can you just share the resources and I'll develop something, but feeling a little bit anxious about asking folks about that.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that question. Thank you, Dr. Gordon. I can speak to that, and Erin probably wants to add as well. I think certainly the pieces that are not ours, right? I mean, Erin talked about like the Forward Through Ferguson work, and some of the different pieces, obviously, that we have incorporated, we don't own. And so we're always happy to share that information with people in terms of, here's some of the pieces that we built on, right? The culture change pieces, all those different pieces. I think we'd be happy to share. Erin, is there anything else?
No, I think we're trying to really find that both and with the copyright being, I really appreciate Dr. Forrester, what you said, because it is true that DEI kind of needs to establish itself, and we're often so busy doing the work, we're not telling the stories. And so trying to pause and make time to do that. And we want to, so that's one of our transformative values, right? Both and, either or. We're looking at a both and we, throughout our curriculum, are shouting out people. Like when we talk about intersectionality, we are obviously giving room to Kimberly Crenshaw's voice, right? Like we put her on the screen and let her talk about it. And so trying to really amplify leaders in the space throughout the curriculum, and even doing things like sharing the Metzel article and things like that. So I think it's a both and, that we very much want to share our work, but then also we're really trying to, in the sessions, amplify the voices of the people who have led the way.
All right, we have another question in the chat. It says, WashU is a private institution. Did you get any pushback from your board of trustees or the government in Missouri?
Not from Board of Trustees, and I think particularly because our executive faculty, which is our governing body, that doesn't supersede the Board of Trustees, but because we had their full support, I think that's why we didn't get any pushback. In terms of Missouri legislature, right now there are 2 bills in the Missouri legislature around eliminating DEI in medical education, very targeted. And our government relations people are working on ensuring that hopefully those bills don't make it out of committee. That's being partially led by Do No Harm. I'm sure you all are familiar with the Do No Harm organization. And so that's something that they are working on. And my dean keeps saying to me, don't worry about it, Sheree. I'm like, okay, I won't worry about it. So I try not to think about it.
And just a comment. Oh, sorry. What? Go ahead, Erin, and I'll make a comment.
Well, no, I was just going to say really quickly, one of the things that we hear in terms of recruitment to people from, when we're trying to diversify our staff and faculty, or our faculty and our trainees, is like, how do you recruit to St. Louis and Missouri? And the state's not helping us out a ton. But what we like to say is that kind of what I started with is that St. Louis, we understand these issues intimately, as does Baltimore, right? And because of that, we have some of the nation's leading experts. We have some people in our community doing revolutionary work. And so if you're interested in equity work, this is a place to come. And it doesn't, if you're in, not that you have to do the work, but if that's an area of interest, if you're interested in reducing inequities, this is a really prime time to be in our region, and just being really transparent about that. We have a lot of challenges, but that we also have a lot of leadership and opportunity. So I know sometimes that comes up in terms of like, how do you recruit people to a place where you're famous for your racism? We're trying to become famous for our anti-racism too.
So I will say, and I again, I appreciate everybody's contribution to this conversation, is that DEI as an acronym is sort of becoming a new target. I just watched something talking about this DEI is replacing woke as the sort of like the buzzword to then incorporate some level of pushback, as you all were talking about that pushback. And so I'm interested in, and there's a lot of work at high levels in the legislature, not only at the state level, but also at the federal level, to minimize DEI and to control the narrative of what DEI actually means. And so I'm interested for this group, because I think that was the spirit of why I invited you here, is that the centralizing nature of how you all are doing it and having that Office of DEI is something that we do not have formally in our School of Medicine. We have it in different places, but not in our School of Medicine. We're working on it. And so I just would wonder what you all would speak to is terms of having that centralizing structure, how, especially for our psychiatry colleagues, how that reinforces what you're doing because you have the central support.
I can start, and certainly Patty and Nahal may want to speak to this. I think it's so critical to have this sort of central coordinating effort. And I think, Dr. Forrester, when you and I talked previously, I was saying that I find it interesting, and I'm not saying this is what Marilyn is saying, but sometimes I talk to people at different institutions and they'll say, a president or chancellor will say, well, DEI is the work of everybody. We don't need one person. But we don't say that about academic affairs. We don't say that about finance. We don't say that typically about anything else except DEI. And as you heard me say, I'm not a diversity czar. Again, it is about building capacity and getting everyone on board. That's one of the principles of inclusive excellence, is weaving it throughout the institution and throughout the school. But someone has to lead the work, right? And to move it forward. So that's what I would say, at least initially. Patty, I don't know if you Neha want to add in terms of psychiatry and how that has helped or not.
Yeah, I mean, to have the Office of DEI, that's ODEI, what I've been saying, it's just been absolutely critical and just instrumental for us to have some infrastructure and leadership to then come to our department head and vice chairs and say, there is this infrastructure, there are these recommendations, there are these training programs, there's a partnership, all of the above that's coming from our Office of DEI that we can work to implement and move forward in psychiatry. It just sort of gives us this, this guide to and partnership to start really moving things forward at a much more, I would say, much more rapid pace. It's just, for me as the vice chair of DEI, it just really gives me a guidebook to follow and partnership. And again, and then getting together with other DEI leaders across our institution, and all of that being driven by the Office of DEI and, and then our medical school dean too. It just, again, it's, I don't know how else this could be done. I don't think it would be done well at all without, we would do our best. I would do my best, but it would be very difficult without the Office of DEI. It would be very challenging. So I don't know any different, but I can only imagine that, we need, I need them. It has been especially helpful and instrumental in us getting impactful things done.
And I'll just quickly add, because I know we have to wrap up. I think just reemphasizing the importance of that shared language. Just by watching our department go through DEI 1.0 to 4.0, I'm seeing the shift, that the language that's used. So I think the shared language is very important. And just, I think that the framework around like best practices, like connecting, making sure that as we're mentioning DEI, we're connecting it to best practices. And I know like Cherie introduced us to this idea of inclusive excellence. And I think when you start framing things that way, it starts pulling back from that association of, like you said, Dr. Forrester, of like DEI is woke culture and versus DEI is inclusive excellence. And I think if we just also keep just repeating, and this is that consistency in communication, you start connecting those two versus the other associations that are trying to happen. But I know we have to wrap up. I can say more in the next discussion part, but I wanted to mention those quick points.
Well, thank you so much. We, on behalf of the Department of Psychiatry here at University of Maryland, I thank you so much for taking the time to present your framework to us. Hopefully this gives us a chance to reflect and further build and expand what we're doing. And certainly we hope to maybe collaborate in the future, pick your brains in other capacities. So thank you so much. And for everybody else on the call, there's an after session. I've included the link in the chat so everybody can just click that and go in if you have more detailed questions for the group.
Thank you, Dr. Forrester, again for the invitation. We'd love to do a road trip.
Absolutely.
I said in the chat, I'm like, I'm happy to come to Baltimore anytime.
All right, let's do it. And vice versa. We'd love to come to St. Louis. So thank you so much again for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you. I think we're going to do a 10-minute break before the next session.
Yes. So
okay.
Feel free to join the link, but you have 10 minutes before we get started into questions.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.